Sorry guys, I tried real hard, but sometimes there's just no coming up with cold opens. It's not like they grow on trees. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Storytime for another installment of MCU Retrovision. Today we're going to be discussing everyone's favorite movie about everyone's favorite Avenger, Ant-Man and the Wasp, together at last, again, for the first time. As a welcome change of pace, there isn't anything seriously problematic with this movie, which means you get to not be exposed to another one of my asides about fun things like child abuse, chattel slavery, or revisionist Holocaust history. Instead, we'll just be focusing on the movie's mediocre story elements for a change. How exciting! To be honest, it'll be kind of nice to A, not have to talk about gross or terrible things, and B, actually turn in a video of reasonable length. And to be even more honest, I don't think I hated this movie when I revisited it. In fact, I don't think I even disliked it. There was a fair amount I even enjoyed.
I know, kids. I'm scared too.
Of course, that doesn't mean it's not a lazy, incoherent mess, and is primarily just late season filler before we get to our big finale, but at least it's not bloaty or full of itself or propagating gross worldviews. It's the little things, really. Anyway, I'll be spoiling the movie and stuff, not that anyone remembers what happens. So, as always, if you're not into that, you're free to go.
You're free to go.
Ant-Man and the Wasp is a 2018 film directed by Peyton Reed, who you'll remember also directed Ant-Man and the Ant-Man. The film was written by all of these guys, who I'm sure worked closely together in a well-thought-out collaborative way.
Time to discuss this in committee!
I am not a committee!
Seeing as how the final product is so coherent, the movie picks up the story of our pal Scott Lang, who was just about to finish his last few days of house arrest after the whole sort of being a terrorist thing. Lucky he only got 2 years. During that time, he's been setting up a security consultancy business with his stereotype friends and bonding with his daughter, who fortunately is allowed to see him by Scott's ex and Scott's ex's husband, who you'll remember were definitely understanding about his life of crime the first time around. But don't worry, it's fine. It's not a crime if Captain America is involved. It's called being a patriot.
Once something has been approved by the government, it's no longer immoral.
But you know who's not okay with Scott's moonlighting? Hope and Hank, who are apparently implicated in Scott going to Germany to be a terrorist for some reason. Now they're not really speaking. That is, until the plot comes to Scott in a vision, telling him he actually does remember stuff from his quantum realm excursion in the last movie, like such as where Mrs. Hank is and how to find her and stuff. Now we gotta get the gang back together to build a quantum tunnel to get Mrs. Hank back before she vanishes forever. Again, and before a mysterious new adversary steals the tunnel first, and before Scott's FBI parole officers notice he's gone and lock him up forever. Again.
Recidivism.
Repeat offender.
These are the characters. Scott Lang. If you'll remember from the first Ant-Man, Scott's journey involved forsaking the life of crime he loved so much in order to become a more responsible person, which in order to be successful at, he needed to become even more of a criminal, except it's fine because he was thwarting a bad guy. If you weren't clear how all of that was supposed to actually work, good news! This movie has exactly the same arc, so we can just try again. Only, except for a 6-year stint in actual prison for being Robin Hood one time and stealing funds from a company that was defrauding its customers and giving that money back to the customers and having his wife treat him like he's a career criminal, this time he has a 2-year stint in house arrest for destroying a German airport to aid and abet a terrorist in violation of serious international law. And his wife doesn't seem to care since I guess he can watch the kid on weekends now. But don't worry, he still has to put his entire future and relationship with his daughter on the line in order to go on shrinky adventures with his former girlfriend for the greater good or whatever. Hope. Hope has been working with her father, Hank, to build a quantum tunnel since Scott went to the quantum realm and came back, leading her to believe she can find her mother for some reason. She has also turned into the Wasp at some point, a girl Ant-Man with wings and lasers. She also doesn't like Scott anymore since he used his shrinky suit to help terrorists and didn't even invite her along. Don't worry, it only lasts until she kidnaps him, then she's won over once again by his charms. Yay, true love. Hank. Hank is, for all intents and purposes, the same character as Hope, being that they want and work toward the same things for the same reasons and feel the same way about Scott, except that Hank is an elderly man who doesn't want to sleep with him. As far as we know. Ghost Lady. The closest thing we get to a villain in this movie is Ghost Lady, who definitely has a real name that we learn. She phases due to a terrible accident from her youth, when her father was building a quantum tunnel of his own that exploded. Now apparently she is in constant pain, and sometimes can't touch things and stuff, and it is also now a terminal condition after like 15 years. Also, she was trained as an operative for S.H.I.E.L.D. against her will, which means she's extra angry and knows fighting. It seems like she kind of blames all this on Hank, maybe? It's not really clear. At any rate, she wants to steal Hank's quantum tunnel so she can, suck out Mrs. Hank's quantum life force or something to be stable herself, and rather than just ask for help, she decides murder is the answer. We also have Scott's ex and her husband, the stereotype friends, Southern businessman bad guy, Black Hank, who is helping Ghost Lady, and Mrs. Hank, who they do end up rescuing and who can somehow channel quantum energy into healing rays.
We are dealing with science here.
Like the first Ant-Man movie, this one feels fairly detached from the larger MCU apparatus. Apart from the constant references to other MCU characters, this movie could really play independently from the series, which is good. It means that the overall stakes are refreshingly low and really character-driven. No one is trying to save or destroy the world, they just want to find Mrs. Hank to either save or destroy her. Even Bad Business Guy isn't any more nefarious than just wanting to get rich with sweet new tech he will use to do things with, I guess.
Unbelievable. And of course, this could have literally millions of applications here on Earth, and everything from watchmaking to watch repair.
Boring! No!
Everyone basically wants the same thing, but for different reasons. This paves the way for a truly character-driven story. Instead of the normal MCU thing, someone is doing something I don't want them to, so I have to punch them until they stop. It could be more about resolving those various personal conflicts, using the quantum tunnel MacGuffin as a means of aiding the plot along. It could, but that's not what we get. Instead, we get a confused jumble that isn't about anything, for the single reason that this movie has a massive protagonist problem. That is, it is a movie which desperately needs a single protagonist, but which tries just as desperately to fit in two, which works not at all. I'd like to explain this by looking at the wants and needs of our two protagonists, Hope and Hank. We haven't really talked about it on the channel yet, but one way to think about character conflict is by weighing what they want with what they need to do, or think they need to do, to achieve their desires, because plots often sprout from the conflict between those two things. For example, if Frodo wants to save the Shire from the evil of Sauron, he needs to destroy the ring that is in his possession. So, he makes choices to try and accomplish the need in order to get what he wants. Sometimes these choices might be difficult or even incorrect, which of course generate additional conflict for him and the story, as well as providing situations in which plot can take place. As a critical tool, this approach can be a bit simplistic, but this is MCU, guys. We're not talking about Tarkovsky. First, let's look at Scott's wants and needs. He wants to enjoy a stable life with his daughter. Abstractly, this could be a desire for a restoration of his family, which has been broken since he went to prison 8 years ago.
I just want my kids back.
To achieve that want, Scott needs to not be in jail and be a reliable provider. So, he has been trying to get a security consultancy business off the ground and is dutifully serving out his house arrest sentence. Given this setup, his conflicts should probably be obstacles to starting his business or to staying home on good behavior. Hope's wants and needs are actually fairly similar. She wants to see her mother again, which, abstractly, is a desire for a restoration of her family, which has been broken since her mother's disappearance, however long ago that was.
I'm just doing this because if my parents split up, it's a lot more work for me. When they get along, I get tons more alone time. When they don't, guess who they start spending all their time with? Me.
In order to achieve her desire, Hope needs to rescue her mother from the quantum realm. Given this setup, her conflict should probably be obstacles to the rescue. So, Scott and Hope both kind of want the same thing, that is, a complete family. Therefore, it's not inconceivable that the story would work to bring them together and make each the solution of the other's problem. But on a practical level, their desires actually bring them into direct conflict with each other. Remember, Scott needs to basically do nothing to achieve his desire. He can't leave his house for the next 48 hours and just needs for nothing to go wrong in landing a big client. But of course, all that is jeopardized when Hope kidnaps him to help her find her mother, which Again, since the story is working to bring these two characters together, then resolving this new conflict would naturally drive the story. But the thing is, it just doesn't quite work. And the reason for that is that the plot is really overcomplicated as a result of trying to accommodate two protagonists in the first place. Uh-oh, we're going further down the rabbit hole. We need to keep Scott and Hope's role as protagonists in our heads, but we're going to move into what they actually do, which is the plot, so I guess we get a new segment. Whatever. We've established what Scott and Hope both want, including where they overlap and wanting to complete their families. We've also identified potential obstacles that they may need to overcome to achieve their desires, all of which is material that is ripe for generating productive conflict in the story. But since the movie wants them to both be protagonists, it also causes some needless overcomplications that actually end up detracting from their development as characters, ultimately making for a less good movie. And remarkably, these overcomplications actually stem from laziness.
You know, my party was canceled due to laziness.
A good window into what I'm talking about is to look at the stakes of the story. What is at stake for our characters, what they stand to gain or lose. I already said the stakes are remarkably low for an MCU movie, given that the world isn't going to explode or anything. The stakes I'm talking about here are on a character level. In this movie, the stakes for our two protagonists are really out of balance, and that's where the issue is. For Hope, the stakes are actually very low. If she fails, she won't see her mother again. Which sounds quite serious, but remember, she's already lived most of her life believing she wouldn't see her again, and she has no idea whether she can actually be found in the first place, and it isn't until quite late in the story that she learns that there is a limited time she'll be findable anyway. Hope is acting only on unsubstantiated hope, and at least in the beginning, there's not any actual urgency other than that bad business guy wants the quantum tunnel and she misses her mom. In other words, while she stands to gain a lot, if she fails, things will basically go back to the way they were for the last however many years, and then she can just start working on another plan to get her mother out. Disappointing, of course, but not really the end of the world. It's just back to the old drawing board. On the other hand, the stakes for Scott are incredibly high. If he steps even a little bit out of line by leaving his house or communicating with Hope or Hank, he will go to prison for 20 years, losing all opportunity to raise his daughter. In other words, he has a ton to lose and not really anything to gain by helping Hope, unless he's hopeful to rekindle their relationship, which for a lot of the movie is pretty unclear. Given how out of balance these stakes are, the story is faced with a couple of problems. Hope's incredibly low stakes means it's hard to build a plot around her alone, and Scott's incredibly high stakes mean it doesn't make any sense for him to be in a story centered on Hope's desires. Now, the simple way around this problem would be to just balance the stakes. Hope's situation needs to be a little more urgent and grounded. She has to know from the beginning that her mother is out there and findable for only limited time. And Scott's situation needs to be way less urgent. He's completed his house arrest and he's a free man, but his business is still pretty rocky. But rather than doing things the simple but slightly harder way, the movie chooses the complicated, easy thing and creates a ton of arbitrary urgency so that it feels like Scott actually has some reason to do what he does, leading to a plot that is far too convoluted for its own good, and that actually detracts from the character building it was presumably wanting to do in the first place. These are the ways the movie justifies Scott's continual participation in the plot. Notice that none of them are rooted in his character. Hope kidnaps him. This is played for laughs, even though she knows what will happen to him if he violates his house arrest. It doesn't make her look very sympathetic, and besides that, she doesn't need to kidnap him anyway. At this point, she only knows Scott called Hank and told him about a dream he had, and there's no particular urgency for her to rescue her mother this second. So there's no reason she can't just talk to Scott on the phone or show up in his house and have a conversation where she asks for his help and he says, "Yes, I would love to help you. Just give me 48 hours and I'll meet you at your lab freely and legally." The movie knows it needs some urgency to keep Scott around, so it cooks up this thing that Mrs. Hank's window of rescuability is quickly closing, which Mrs. Hank knows for some reason. For some other reason, Hope acts like she knows this in the beginning, even though we don't find out until over halfway through. Also, Bad Business Guy wants the quantum tunnel right now, for some reason, even though it is technically not finished yet, highly theoretical, and not finishable by him, and therefore presumably not nearly as valuable. But I gotta have that urgency. Also, Ghost Lady is going to die in 2 weeks, so she needs the quantum tunnel right now, before it is finished, and before anyone knows if it will work. So you see, Scott has to stick around. Everything keeps being so urgent he doesn't have a choice. Oh yeah, all of these things except the kidnapping are learned by Hope and Hank after the kidnapping, which means there is actually no real urgency to kidnap Scott in the first place, because the writers didn't think about it until after they had got partway through the draft of the script and didn't want to go back and fix the stakes from the beginning. So instead they just kept inventing stuff to make the situation urgent enough for Scott to keep choosing to stay.
What are you singing, Petey?
Just making it up as I went along, really.
That's just weak songwriting. You wrote a bad song, Petey.
The result is the movie has about 18 ticking clocks. Usually, a ticking clock is a great way to ratchet up the tension. Gotta get off the ship before it explodes in 10 minutes. But if there are too many, they kind of cancel each other out. Gotta get off the ship before it explodes in 10 minutes, but also the wormhole is gonna suck us in 15 minutes, and we're gonna run out of air in an hour unless we fix the generator. In this movie, Scott's gotta get home in 48 hours or he goes to jail forever. But also we gotta find Mrs. Hank in 2 hours after she inhabits Scott's body, or else she'll disappear for another 100 years. But also, Ghost Lady is gonna die in 2 weeks, but really needs that quantum energy hit before the gang rescues Mrs. Hank, because she knows for some reason that she will be able to vampire Mrs. Hank's quantum energy. And also, Bad Business Guy wants the lab right now for some reason, even though it will probably profit him more to wait until it is finished, and he's tipped off the FBI, who for some reason have jurisdiction over Scott's house arrest, that he has flown the coop, so now Scott's gonna get back home now and not in 48 hours. Of course, all of this results in a fast-moving, exciting plot. But it also results in a needlessly confusing plot that sabotages its character development because with so much going on, it doesn't have time for anything else besides managing its ticking clocks. After all the bustle and commotion, it never gives Scott a good character-based reason to keep making the choice to help Hope and Hank.
Well, it's kind of funny. With all the craziness and confusion and mishigas of packing, I forgot to pack.
There's one possibility, that he feels bad for breaking Hope's trust by going to Germany, and he sees helping her now as a way to build back that trust, and to perhaps build a family for his daughter. And the movie does eventually go there, to its credit. However, only after everything is pretty much resolved, because the writers didn't think of it until they were almost done with the script, and didn't want to go back and stitch it in anywhere else.
Due to laziness.
All we need is it to be planted early and we're good. Say, Hope tells Scott that she was mad at him for leaving and makes it clear that asking for his help now is her way of trying to rebuild the bridge, which gives Scott a relevant personal reason to help out, beyond just being a good person or whatever, which isn't really a compelling story motivation. But that's a conversation that doesn't occur until very late, which means that for most of the movie, Scott is making choices that just don't make any sense, making him less sympathetic. So, what we end up with is a story where one of our protagonists and the main point of view character spends most of the runtime making choices that are actively jeopardizing his desires for reasons that are mostly circumstantial with motives that are unclear. His stakes, if he loses, are incredibly high, and yet he does not articulate what he hopes to gain, apart from, once again, like being a helper or something. Meanwhile, our other protagonist is sidelined almost entirely, even though presumably the story is about her. Fortunately, the movie moves so quickly that we never have time to stop and think about any of this, so we can walk away believing that what we saw was a real story instead of a bunch of hectic crap with a few jokes sprinkled in. And all of that because Uncle Kevy wanted to tell a story about a woman trying to find her mother while insisting that the main character be a man. We've talked about how this movie gets needlessly and unproductively complicated due to Scott and Hope both trying to be protagonists, that because his stakes are so incredibly high and hers so terribly low, the story needs to come up with a web of urgent plot threads in order to justify his presence and her passion. We've also discussed that one solution to this problem would be to reduce Scott's stakes a lot and raise Hope's a little, so everyone's choices feel more reasonable given the situation, helping the audience sympathize with them. But there is another solution: just have less Scott in the first place. But you say, hold on, dude, this is Ant-Man's movie, we can't just cut him out of it. But think about it. Is this really Ant-Man's movie? Is it his story? And the answer, of course, is no. It is Hope's story. Or at least it should be. The plot revolves around rescuing Hope's mother from the quantum realm. Obviously, Hank is working toward this as well, but Hope is the one with the most unresolved conflict between the two of them, given what we know from the first movie. Also, she can do kick punches. So, it should be Hope who makes the big decisions and faces the largest struggles as the plot moves along. But the inclusion of Scott in the story, to the degree to which he is featured and with the stakes he has to deal with, means that most of the narrative energy around Hope starts moving from her over to him, and it is once again Scott's story. Obviously, part of this redistribution comes from Hope and Scott coming together as a true team, which is fine, but before that happens, Hope is largely relegated to a supporting player. The best metric for this is how much the movie wants us to worry about Scott's absence from house arrest, a lot, and how little it cares whether Hope and Hank get arrested for the whole aiding terrorism thing, hardly at all. Basically, the movie set out to tell Hope's story, and Marvel thought the best way to do that was to make Scott the protagonist too, and relearn the same lessons from the first movie. Where have we seen this before? In doing so, the story is not only lamer, but also dumber. Far too complicated for its scope and unclear in its themes. The obvious solution for all the problems I've laid out with this plot is to just have less Scott. Hope needs to be the protagonist, and the movie needs to be told from her perspective. Scott can be in it, of course, but as a supporting character and eventual partner on the team. Maybe you could use the house arrest thing to your advantage here. Scott can't leave home, so Hope asks him to quarterback her operations as she gathers material for the quantum tunnel, some of which is maybe government property or stolen by a bad business guy or whatever and needs to be heisted. Whatever his involvement, the less weight Scott has in the story, the more we'll be able to focus and deepen Hope's character, and the better we'll be able to explore Ghost Lady, who gets even more shafted by the movie. How refreshing would it have been to have a Marvel story where a lady hero is struggling against a lady villain who's actually pretty sympathetic when she's not terrifying, and they're able to resolve things not with kick punching, but with another lady who has quantum magic. There's seriously no story reason why this movie couldn't just be called The Wasp. Even if you have to put Ant-Man in the title to keep marketability or whatever, no one's going to be disappointed if the movie is Evangeline Lilly kicking a bunch of butt, while Paul Rudd sits in his attic control room commanding armies of ants, making wisecracks, and eventually getting up to hijinks himself once the situation is serious enough in the third act. They can have romantic witty banter and a grand old time, and Hope can have her own full story. Then when Ant-Man 3 comes around, both characters will be fully set up, and they can take things as partners. Or we can just let the man take over the boring girl story because we've already got a girl superhero coming out in a few months. What more do you people want? 2 girl superheroes? Marvel loves women. While we're talking about the ladies, let's talk about Ghost Lady, who was treated as poorly by the movie as she's treated in the movie, which takes some doing. One of the things that sets her apart is she is one of the few truly sympathetic villains MCU has cooked up, being herself primarily a victim. Her father's quantum tunnel explodes, killing her parents and leaving her with a terrible permanent condition, which is extremely painful and apparently terminal. Rather than treat her, the good folks at S.H.I.E.L.D. exploited her condition by training her to murder people. As a result, she harbors a lot of very justified anger and is operating in desperate survival mode, which unfortunately drives her to make some poor choices, such as wanting to destroy Mrs. Hank to get her sweet, sweet quantum energy. But it doesn't seem like all this really makes her a villain, right?
Hey, adopted brother. Do you think I could have a hit of that juice box that...
The thing is, all this comes across in the movie as her mostly just being, hysterical at best, and maniacal at worst. She has the same kind of problem as Killmonger and Black Panther. Even though their motives and reasoning are actually pretty understandable, they are both acting like unhinged homicidal psychos who just need to be stopped before they cause serious damage. At the end of the day, Ghost Lady really has no conflict with Hank and Hope. The story doesn't give a reason why vampiring Mrs. Hank's quantum energy is the only way for Ghost Lady to live. She's just portrayed as being too crazy to be able to understand or consider reason, so the movie doesn't even try. Allow a moment of script doctoring. Instead of going to Black Hank for help and then being double-crossed, Hank and Hope are approached by Black Hank. He has heard about the quantum tunnel they're working on and has a proposition. Allow him to contribute his research and university resources to help build it so that his adopted daughter, Ghost Lady, can hopefully be helped by quantum energy. After all, she was treated horribly by S.H.I.E.L.D., which Hank also hates. While initially there are some trust issues given Ghost Lady's problematic past as a murder bot, and the way Hank and Black Hank broke up back in the day, The gang warms up to them eventually as they work together to dodge bad business guys' henchmen time and again. But, as her condition worsens, Ghost Lady becomes more desperate, eventually jeopardizing Hope's and Hank's goal of finding Mrs. Hank. She doesn't try to kill her necessarily, but maybe she steals the lab at an inopportune time, or tries to work the tunnel without fully knowing how and breaks it or something.
Hey, what the hell happened to the blood? Hey, brother.
The movie can still end with Mrs. Hank using quantum energy on her and whatever, but now she actually gets to be a character who develops and doesn't just act like a violent psycho who was shuffled off screen at the earliest possible moment. This is the rare MCU movie that really doesn't need a typical antagonist, and lazily trying to make Ghost Lady one just feels cheap. But as we know, Marvel loves women, so maybe I'm missing something. Here are my other thoughts about Ant-Man and the Wasp, not all of which are negative. 1. For all the problems this movie has at the plot level, one of the things I really like about it is how it exploits its central gimmick. If your main characters can manipulate their sizes drastically, you want to see them get up to hijinks and use that to their advantage in fun, creative ways, which this movie really knows how to do. I also appreciate that it keeps finding new ways to make it entertaining. It's really funny when Scott gets stuck at like little kid size or just big enough to use a flatbed truck like one of those medical knee scooters. Most other MCU movies either don't have fun gimmicks like this or don't know how to use them, so commendations to Ant-Man for leaning into it so hard. 2. I also like how Scott's relationship with his daughter is portrayed. Since it forms such a keystone of his characterization and motivation, I'm glad that it's something we're actually really shown and not just told about, like how Steve Rogers and Bucky are the best of friends, for example. 3. The movie desperately needs some quantum realm exposition, since it is primarily about getting there to rescue Mrs. Hank. In the first movie, we learn it is like a subatomic purgatory where you can essentially just get infinitely smaller forever. But in this movie, it acts like a fixed plane where a person's location can be plotted somehow, and where vehicles can be piloted. Some quick questions. What is quantum energy? What can it do? How is it harnessed? How does quantum realm geography correspond to normal space? Mrs. Hank goes subatomic thousands of miles from San Francisco, but that is where they enter the quantum realm and quickly find her. How does one survive in the quantum realm? What has Mrs. Hank been eating all these years? Those nasty lice bear monsters? How are there naturally occurring subatomically sized organisms? How are there nasty lice bear monsters? If time supposedly works different down there, as Hank implies in the first movie, and which we confirm in Endgame, why does Mrs. Hank appear to have aged at the same rate as everyone else? I guess because it would be creepy for Michael Douglas to be with a woman who looks so much younger with them. Oh wait, how does anyone know anything about this place? Are they making informed guesses based on theoretical physics? Or do they actually somehow know? And so on. The point is, it feels like everything we learn about the quantum realm in this movie was just made up the moment the writers needed something in the script, like kids making up rules to a game as they go along, which is not usually how you want a story to be, but whatever.
Just making it up as I went along, really.
That's just weak songwriting.
4. On top of a hectic plot, the movie has some unproductive tone issues that need to be pointed out. Generally, the tone is really fun and lighthearted and does a lot to remind us that we're here for a fun time and that stakes aren't that high. But this contrasts with what is going on in the story, which is actually fairly serious and high stakes. It's not a major problem, but again, points to hasty, underworked writing. Another draft would have worked this out. 5. This is a small thing, but how did Hope get Scott's ankle monitor off and onto a giant ant? Seems like the whole point is that would be hard to do, otherwise the arrested person might find some way to take it off and leave. Even if she just shrunk Scott down, wouldn't it have some way of knowing he's not wearing it anymore? Whatever, it's fine. 6. Another small thing. Why can Scott take his helmet off when he's stuck being child-sized? I thought the whole point of the suit was to make you sizes that aren't yourself without exploding, like we see in Ant-Man 1. It works for the joke, but also that felt like a pretty fundamental thing. Then again, I guess ants can grow without suits, so I don't know. It's all so carefully worked out. 7. Who pays for all the city damage? They do a lot of damage to streets and buildings as business guy's henchmen are chasing them around. I guess they could just pin it all on business guy. I guess the bigger issue is, are Hope and Hank still technically on the lam? We see Hank take his house to Cabo or something, but Hope is just hanging out with Scott and his daughter, and then they're all working up on some rooftop when they get Thanos. Whatever, it's fine. I guess that's it. Like I said, nothing too terrible with this movie. Apart from its plot issues, which are pretty substantial, the movie is actually a lot of fun. A lot of that comes down to Paul Rudd, who is just so charming and fun to be around. But I think it's also because this movie does perhaps the best job of any MCU movie at being just for fun. That's always the excuse that people give, but here I think it applies. There are no nefarious schemes or cosmic implications. It's just a fun adventure with some cool scale elements. Which is, I guess, why it feels so much like a late season filler episode. Back in the days before 8 episodes counted as a season, you'd get episodes at the end of a season that were more or less just to fill the time until the finale. Everyone on the production is tired after making 18 or 15 or 20 shows or whatever, so they don't really bring their A game. These episodes usually feature more supporting characters since the stars are off shooting the big 2-parter finale, and their plots have nothing at all to do with the show's main storyline, since that too was being held for the finale. But you gotta put something out to keep people engaged, otherwise your ratings might suffer.
I don't know. Gotta nuke something.
This is Ant-Man and the Wasp, 19 entries into a series, sandwiched between the big late season cliffhanger and the finale, featuring characters who really work best as supporting cast, doing things that are totally detached from what everyone else in the series was worried about. Apart from introducing the potential of the quantum realm being used to screw with time, this movie exists in a vacuum. The cynical side of me says that is the only reason this movie exists, to lay the groundwork of time travel for Avengers Endgame, the one piece of narrative planning that actually did go into the series finale, so that's good? But who's to say late series filler episodes can't also be kind of fun? That one in X-Files where the shape-shifting guy locks up Mulder so he can go be a glamorous FBI agent for a couple days is pretty good. Anyway, thanks as always for watching. Coming up next, we've got the penultimate film in the MCU Infinity Saga, Captain Marvel, the real First Lady superhero who will surely play a pivotal, non-incidental role in the final showdown in the final endgame. Oh, good night.
You wrote a bad song, Petey.
No sugar for you, you just get more awful.